And we're good to go.
Should we just start?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Reanna Esmail, and I'm joined by my colleague. I'll just introduce you, Ashley. Ashley Shea. We're both here at Cornell University. I'm the lead librarian for instruction, and Ashley is the head of instruction and research initiatives. And we're going to be talking today about digital privacy as a bedrock for critical information literacy. So we're going to be kind of going through this fairly quickly. Usually this is a much longer, it's kind of a reflection on much longer presentation we give for students. So we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, algorithms, and privacy. So kind of to get started, jumping into AI, a lot of times when we're talking about AI, particularly in the university setting, we're actually talking about generative AI. And in order to understand generative AI, I'm going to go through a few key terms that we might be kind of revisiting throughout the presentation. So first off, corpus. What is a corpus? A corpus is a sample or collection of text, images, or other types of data. So really, it's kind of everything that a large language model or any of these sort of generative models, including generative image models, are using to kind of make their outputs. The other thing that they're tending to do when they have this corpus of text, they're taking individual words or documents or images and breaking them apart into smaller parts known as tokens. So these could be parts of words, they could be pixels, they could be vectors of images. A good way to think about this is autocomplete, like if you're texting and your iPhone is telling you what word may come next, or Google autocomplete. A lot of large language models are thinking of tokens in relation to either a larger sentence, a larger image, or a larger document. And then the last kind of key term that we're going to be kind of talking about throughout the session is training objectives. So this is the model's aim or objective, really how it is choosing to both tokenize the information, and how it's kind of reacting to the corpus of data. However, unfortunately, there's still a lot of opacity when we're talking about AI and about algorithmic systems in general, because we don't know the corpus of data that they are using to train their models. We don't know this training objective, and we also don't know how they're breaking apart the different documents, words, or images.
Yeah, so jumping into algorithms, and Reanna, you can move right through there. Yeah, so I think just to make sure we all have a baseline understanding for the rest of this presentation, generally when we talk about algorithms with students, but even amongst ourselves, I think it's helpful to think that we're really talking about the code that is meant to solve problems, and that code has been trained to solve those problems on certain data. And so when we're thinking about algorithmic systems, which is what I'm about to talk about, it's important to think of the distinctions that exist between how these different systems have been trained with the underlying mechanisms, the underlying algorithms. So you can move ahead to the next slide. So there's generally 3 algorithmic systems that I think are helpful to introduce to students and that we try to include in our discussion when we're talking about information literacy and digital literacy and how it converges with issues of privacy. So the first system is what is called consequential systems. And these are what we generally on academic campuses are quite familiar with, because consequential systems include academic databases. This is when you, as the user, are given the most choice and the most say over what your results will be. So you go in and you can say, for title, these are the keywords I'm interested in, etc. And another example is Apple News. The first time you're setting up your iPhone, for example, you can choose what news sources you're interested in seeing on a day-to-day basis. So consequential really is putting the user and their needs, their preferences at the forefront in a mostly transparent way, more transparent than what we're about to talk about. Preferential is the second kind of system, and this is what many of us are also familiar with. Anyone that's used Google search or has used social media, for example, this is where our past behavior, our past clicks, our past typed words, our past searching and scrolling, our past purchases are used, and an online persona is created to then recommend subsequent future results that will be relevant or have been deemed relevant in line with our past behaviors. And so these examples include things like autocomplete, Amazon book recommendations, etc. So taking our past behaviors that we ourselves have engaged with to predict what we will in the future want to engage with. And then the third is what we call, if you move on to the next one, preemptive. So preemptive is the most problematic, I would say, and also the most opaque. And preemptive systems tend to be used by corporations, by members of the state, and the sole purpose or the primary purpose is to make predictions to mitigate risk for that state, for that company. Preemptive systems are used in the court systems to make decisions about parole or recidivism and who should be out and if that recommendation aligns with past performance, past behaviors. So much bias obviously is incorporated into this when we're thinking about past behaviors. And so a couple examples here, the no-fly list, interest rates that are determined based on your past purchases, your past loan payments, etc. And so those are the three to help contextualize the conversation moving forward.
So kind of getting into what this all means, algorithms, and as Ashley and I are both librarians, we're particularly interested in information access. And so algorithms ultimately shape the information we see, the information we use, and the information we deem credible. But in thinking about algorithms, we wanted to kind of give a few examples of bias and how it's working within algorithmic systems. So the first example that I like to show students is Tay tweets, which some of you may be familiar with, some may not be. It's also nice, not nice, but it tends to be eye-catching because it has this sort of salacious title. But Tay was a 16-year-old chatbot, 16-year-old girl who existed on Twitter, Microsoft's first sort of precursor to like a ChatGPT that we see now in 2016. So obviously there were a few oversights. One, the programmers thought that it was a positive to be a 16-year-old girl on Twitter. Two, they didn't kind of realize the ways in which this could very easily get out of hand. So Tay learned from interactions on Twitter. So typically with a lot of these systems, they tend to be very black box, as Ashley mentioned. So we don't actually know both how they're learning and the corpus of data that they're being trained on. Whereas Tay was slightly different because we got to see what was being put in. And then we also got to see in real time how that changed. Microsoft announced Tay tweets. She was very quickly co-opted by the sort of edgelord message board 4chan, who just started tweeting at her a bunch of like racist, sexist, xenophobic, homophobic, anti-Semitic, you name it, they were tweeting at her. And in real time, she became racist and xenophobic and also hypersexualized. Another example here is Sophia Noble's work on the Google algorithm in her book, Algorithms of Oppression, where she interrogated the reasons why these search engines reinforce racism. And kind of moving into AI now, this is a recent example from about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Google's generative image creator, Gemini, in a way to kind of keep it from reinforcing racist stereotypes, instead decided to create like a sort of multicultural world. But unfortunately, that also is somewhat problematic when we're thinking about how we talk about different historical moments and images related to them. Similarly, the kind of follow-up to Tay tweets with Zoe, where you interact with Zoe about anything. Like, for example, if you were to say, next week is my bat mitzvah, Zoe would not respond. And so Gemini, in a similar way, was like colorblind. And it ends up kind of being this weird sort of like Shonda Rhimes, Bridgerton world, which isn't necessarily historically accurate or useful for learning. So kind of moving into big data and data brokerage, how do these systems kind of learn about people? So these systems learn through what is called personal identifiable information. Every day, just existing within the world, we leak little bits and pieces about ourselves online. An example that we like to use for students is, for example, maybe you sign up for a free ice cream cone on your birthday at Baskin & Robbins. Baskin & Robbins can sell that data. They can share that data, and they can also you trade that data for other data. And so a lot of times when we're talking about these systems, they're using what's called big data, which are like large data profiles, and how those are created is through this process of data onboarding, where data brokers are stitching together both your online and offline data. I'm going to show you a really kind of overwhelming graph here. This is a sort of a big data model. And so you'll see here on the bottom corner that you have your public data with driver's licenses and criminal records, but then you also have like data coming in and out to Fortune 500 companies, data going to social media networks, and then also data going into the system from like smart TVs and the like.
Yeah, so how do we now think about this in terms of privacy rights? So as Reanna mentioned, we're constantly leaking information, and that information is deeply connected to our behaviors, to our purchases, to our birthday, to what we sign up for. And so when these models are then taking that data that is very personal in many cases, and using that to inform and influence what we see and what others see, there's the question of privacy rights, right? And so on the next slide, let's think about this from a historical perspective. So in this country, in society at large, we tend to think of privacy as an individual right. And in fact, this has roots as we trace them back to the conception of privacy as a human right back decades ago. Now, as our public realm, prior slide still, as our public realm and our private sphere increasingly blur, right, as we engage in interactions on social media with our close peers, but we also have other strangers within that sphere as well, these realms mix. As Reanna mentioned, with the case of Baskin Robbins, we take our personal information, our birth date, our driver's license, and we use that for other public services. These realms mix. And so increasingly, we are in what has been deemed these ambivalent spaces where we're not sure what to disclose, or even when and if we're disclosing, and concealment, and when and how to conceal. And so supposedly, we as the users in this country that prioritize the individual in the control seat should be selecting and deciding based on that. But often, because of these data brokers that many of us are not even fully aware of, and because of the opacity, it's a much more complicated thing. And so putting the onus entirely on the individual requires instruction of that individual to understand these broader socio-technical systems. So now you can move on. Thank you. So now we're in this phase where we're thinking about this place that individuals engage in, this privacy calculus, which believes that individuals are fully rational and deliberate every time they're deciding when to disclose information and when to conceal that information, versus this privacy paradox, which, unlike this deliberate mindset, is instead saying, actually, we have bounded rationality. We have limited cognitive resources. We rely on superficial heuristics to make our decisions. And so it's a paradox. We really can't control all aspects of our privacy. And so we're constantly in between this space where we try to be deliberate and promote more deliberation. And a mechanism to doing that is to understanding these broader complex systems, but also recognizing that necessarily individuals resort to cognitive shortcuts that also influence when and how and if information is disclosed. So this seems like an important time to talk about the distinction between privacy and security. So these are certainly related concepts. Security is that protection of digital material from theft, hacking, unauthorized use, whereas privacy, when we're talking about it, it's really your right as an individual to own your data that you've generated by your life behaviors, right? By all of the things that you engage with throughout your day, your activities, your clicks, etc. And being able to restrict that outward flow, who gets that data and who can use it. So the question that we're left with as instructors, right, grappling with this complex landscape is how do we replace that illusion of control where we feel like we can with actual practical solutions so we can control as much personal information as possible, recognizing this continuum that we're on where there is that paradox, but we also want to increase aspects of control at the individual level too.
So we do this generally by having the students do some hands-on activities. A lot of times when you're teaching, kind of lecturing them about the dangers of living online can just be hard for them to grapple with because it's hard to kind of see that in context. So the first activity that we'll sometimes do is we'll have them search for themselves either their email address or phone number on this website called Have I Been Pwned, which is website that compiles data breaches. Another activity that we do kind of in line with this is we might have them search on both Google and Privacy Badger, their actual name, and then the word address or the phrase phone number to see if they're included on any direct-to-consumer data brokers, and usually, unfortunately, they are. Another activity that we will do is just giving them an opportunity to look at their own social media feeds. So kind of building off of this project from the markup called part of their citizen browser project called Split Screen, where they looked at different social media feeds for millennials versus boomers, Trump supporters versus Biden supporters, women versus men, very sort of binary, but kind of allowing them to talk about their own social media feeds. This is also just a great activity to kind of get the students feeling comfortable talking about these topics. They love talking about their social media feeds. And usually after kind of having done this activity, we can launch into some more critical activities, and they're more likely to share their experiences and to be a little bit more communicative throughout the rest of the session. Another activity we like to use is kind of to sort of demystify the idea of algorithms a little bit. So because library resources themselves are essentially just really large data sets, we allow them to sort of create an algorithm by really creating a search and then looking at the results of that search and selecting maybe 3 different resources and thinking about what they would want to appear in that search and how they would describe those materials. So also allowing them to think a little bit about metadata and how things are kind of linked together, that linked data sort of piece can allow them both to understand better library like information infrastructure as well as the information infrastructure elsewhere. And then kind of moving into AI-focused activities, usually we'll do some activities with GPT prompting. The example I have on the screen here is actually from Microsoft's Copilot, because Cornell has like an early license to use Copilot. So this is just an example that I pulled this morning, actually, where a lot of times the instructions that students will get about the best uses for generative AI are actually to summarize materials. But unfortunately, these systems aren't particularly good at summarizing materials. So in the example that you see on the screen, which might be, to be honest, really hard to read, I uploaded a text file of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and asked Copilot to summarize it. The summary they gave doesn't even mention Elizabeth Bennet. And then I asked them to just give a general summary of Pride and Prejudice, where they're actually pulling from resources like SparkNotes and Wikipedia. And the summary is obviously much better, but if we're thinking about this for resources that are maybe less represented on the internet, this can obviously create sort of information gaps, and can also, if they're kind of just looking at that particular summary that isn't as thorough, can also lead to less successful student coursework. So this also gives them an opportunity to kind of think about the pitfalls of AI. Other activities that you could do AI focused is also having them maybe change out keywords that they're using to think a little bit more about those tokens and the ways things are kind of relationally linked together. And then we also like to give them some resources for kind of opting out or understanding the threat. And Ashley's going to launch into this.
Yeah, so in addition to saying like, you can control some things, but not everything, we also feel like we need to empower them to know what and how they can control things. And so the first step is really introducing them to some tools too. And so in the next slide here, you'll see, oh, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. So first we need to tell students why privacy should matter. And really it's positioning this as budding scholars, right? As people that are about to be entering this next phase of adulthood. Students are on the cusp of gaining new civic responsibilities and rights in terms of voting and civic engagement. And so privacy should matter because threats to that privacy are threats to their intellectual growth and development and their freedom to explore academic topics. And so when we extract that and take it one step further, it's also implicating their future behaviors and their organizations that they're also within. And so on the next slide is when we talk about things that you can do practically. So one is you can turn off your Wi-Fi and Bluetooth when you're not using them. So that data is not being collected and used. One thing that's particularly annoying for students that like to have that default, but is actually a practical strategy, is to clear cookies and cache every couple of weeks, because in doing so, you're reducing and eliminating who is following you and tracking. Rejecting all non-essential cookies. There's no reason to take anything more beyond those that are essential. Deleting apps that you don't need or don't use, and turning off location services on your phone when not needed. And then some tools that we recommend are ad blockers, some browsers that tend to preserve more privacy than the more common browsers. Similarly, search engines that aren't necessarily relying on your past behavior to then recommend based on your current search, but instead are just recommending based on your current search alone and not what you've done or looked for in the past. And then other tools like Track This too. And it's also important in the context of academic communities in which we're mostly situated, is also talking about the role that library databases have in relation and in comparison to a lot of other popular commercial sources for looking for information. For example, databases in the library do not give personalized results because they're not storing and preserving that data to then influence what it gives to you subsequently. And so doing that contrast and comparison, I think, is also important. So going back to those 3 algorithmic system types that we discussed at the very beginning, it's adding nuance and understanding that some tend to preserve more of your privacy than others.
These are just some resources that we also give them so they can kind of continue. But then we also kind of like to leave on a little bit on a hopeful note, but well, somewhat hopeful. We like to also mention that unfortunately a lot of the onus for opting out and for privacy kind of ethics rely on individuals, where these threats to privacy and the onus should actually be on laws, systems, and policies that don't currently protect data as personal property or as rights. And then this is just something that I'd like to mention is, unfortunately, libraries themselves, I know we've been talking a lot about different library systems, are not exempt from these practices. This is the book that came out last year, or 2 years ago now, Data Cartels by Sarah Lambden. And I'm just going to read a quick quote from it. Like Facebook, Amazon, Relics, and Thomson Reuters have privatized and now controlled social spaces that used to be public. They are the information landlords that decide who can swim in the ocean of knowledge. And she's really referring to the fact that a lot of library vendors have moved into data brokerage spaces and are also consolidating and merging. So they are becoming these sort of like huge kind of monopolies on information. And we're also seeing other issues of library vendors, including recently Overdrive, who have been selling patron browsing records to advertisers. So unfortunately, like the system isn't just happening outside of libraries, but also within them. But then we do like to always also end with some further reading and some additional resources, including some resources for removing yourself from data brokers and resources that we have at Cornell, like privacy consultations and the like. But otherwise, these are some nonprofits if folks are interested. Thank you so much for your attention, and we look forward to your questions.
Folks can feel free to come off mute to ask questions or put them in the chat.
Paul, you put your camera on first. You go on the first question.
Yeah, this is kind of in the weeds, but so you mentioned the ways in which people's personal information, for example, their past loan history, can be used by these algorithms to make decisions about them that may be biased decisions. I think, but I'm looking for confirmation that part of the problem here is not just that these algorithms may use your personal information and your personal data history, but they may be looking at things like what neighborhood do you live in? And then they're making predictions about your reliability, right, as someone to loan money to, that are disconnected from your actual history, but are just putting you into a category and then deciding based on that.
Yeah, I'll jump in here, and Ashley,
Yeah.
feel free to add on. I should mention, like, this, we did have to take out a lot in our presentation because 25 minutes, but yeah, we do actually talk a lot with the students about like sort of like data buckets that they're put into, and the ways in which like your search behaviors don't necessarily just influence like these systems in terms of like what results they give you and decision making for you, but also for other individuals. You're the sort of big data profiles that you're put into kind of like a type. So
Right.
it, like, everything is code. You are like for me like a Muslim librarian who works at an Ivy institution, something like that. And then it's very hard to kind of break out of those. So we do talk a little bit about that, as well as we also show them, there's a project from the markup about mortgage approval ratings that actually has like an interactive map to show like where the likelihood of a mortgage approval, and also how that's influenced by race and demographics.
Yeah.
But Ashley, I'm sure I forgot something here.
No, as you were talking, I was looking for that very link. So you and I
Yeah.
were on the very same page, and I just dropped that in the chat so you all can see it. It's fascinating. You can go in and click on a distinct geographic region in the country, and you can see the user profile that's been created by these mortgage lender companies. And so if it's a particularly Hispanic area, for example, that's part
Yeah.
of your profile information. And if it's a low income, et cetera. And so you can see it. It's really interesting. We've talked about this. I've said this word several times. The opacity makes it very hard to then understand. But increasingly, there's what's called this ethnography of algorithmic systems. So you can understand through various people in different regions and different areas with different demographic profiles doing same requests and then seeing different outputs from that. And so this is how we understand increasingly over time what is happening. And this was a really fascinating project that I thought was really eloquently done, and shows you visually, oh my goodness, how different it would be if I was this person living in this part of the country versus this, and my mortgage rate would be very different.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. It's definitely right in our conference themes, something that we're thinking about, something that we're going to continue discussing in the keynote this afternoon. And so it's great to hear from you.
Thank you for having us. And if anyone is interested in our slides, happy to email copies over, especially for the activities, because I know we went through them fairly quickly.
There will be an email that will get sent to you tomorrow asking you to upload your slides, and then the slides will be right on the conference schedule. So both yours and anyone else who shares their stuff, if people continue to go back to the conference webpage, we'll have the videos and the slides available there for download.
Great. Well, thank you so much to the organizers. And Reanna, we made it in just 30 minutes. So we fit a lot in.
You stuck the landing. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. This was fabulous. Tons of really useful information and just real clarity. Great. Thank
Oh,
you.
good. Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording.